The Madeira was the color of blood in candlelight. Isaac watched it from across the room, a river of dark ruby pooling in the crystal decanter on the sideboard. He stood by the hearth, his dark hands clasped behind his back, a statue carved from shadow and patience. The fire hissed, spitting embers onto the stone, each spark a dying star. Outside, a low Charleston wind moaned through the bare branches of the live oaks, a sound like a grieving woman. It was Christmas Eve, in the year of our Lord 1837, and the air in Judge Thaddeus Abernathy's dining room was thick with the scent of roasted duck, pine garlands, and impending death. Isaac's world had shrunk to the geography of this room, the long mahogany table gleaming with a decade of his own beeswax polish, the 12 high-backed chairs where the Abernathy family and their guests would soon sit, the judge, the fort, severe portrait of the judge's father staring down with flinty, unforgiving eyes, and the decanter. Everything came back to the decanter. Inside his waistcoat, tucked into a small leather pouch his wife had sewn for him years ago, were 3 dried, crushed petals of the yellow jessamine, not the flower itself, which was too obvious, but a distillation of its soul, its potent, silent venom. He had spent months gathering the nectar, boiling it down in secret, creating a tincture so powerful a single drop could stun a mule. 3 drops for the judge. 3 for the ones he had lost. 1 for Alara, 1 for Samuel, and 1 for the child she had been carrying. A secret they had whispered to each other in the dark of their cabin. A life that had never drawn breath. The number 3 was a trinity of grief, a prayer said backward. It was the number of lashes from the overseer's whip that had once split his back into a starburst of agony, a scar he still felt in the phantom dampness of a coming storm. 3. The number was holy and profane, the architecture of his revenge. The guests began to arrive, their laughter like the shattering of glass against the oppressive quiet of the house. Isaac moved with the silent, practiced grace of a man who has learned to make himself invisible. He took their cloaks, heavy with the damp sea air, and offered them sherry on a silver tray. He saw their eyes slide over him, seeing not a man but a function, a piece of well-oiled machinery. Judge Abernathy entered last, a mountain of a man in claret-colored velvet, his face ruddy from the wind and wine already consumed. He clapped Isaac on the shoulder, a gesture not of affection but of ownership. "Isaac, my good man, a fine night for it, the Lord's birthday, a time for charity and good." "Cheer, eh?" Isaac inclined his head. "Yes, Master Abernathy." The words were ash in his mouth. Charity. The judge spoke of charity, this man who had sold Isaac's wife and 5-year-old son to a trader from Louisiana to cover a gambling debt. He had watched them go from the cooperage, the scent of turpentine and cedar shavings thick in his nostrils, a smell that had once meant pride and craft, but now and forever would smell of loss. He had seen the terror in Alara's eyes, had watched little Samuel's face crumple as he was lifted into the wagon, his small hand reaching for a father he would never see again. Isaac had roared, a sound torn from the deepest part of his soul, and for that he had been given the 3-pronged scar that still mapped his back. Dinner was a pageant of gluttony. Oysters, terrapin soup, the roasted duck, a great joint of beef, syllabub, and cakes. The Abernathys and their guests, the Pinckneys and the Retts, ate and drank, and talked of cotton prices, and the damned abolitionists in the North. Their voices were a dull drone beneath the roaring in Isaac's ears. He moved around the table, refilling glasses with claret, his movements fluid, his face an impassive mask. He was the perfect servant. He was the angel of death. Finally, the moment came. The main courses were cleared, the port and Madeira brought out. The judge, his face flushed, his eyes glassy, raised his hand for silence. "My friends," he boomed, his voice filling the room, "a toast to a prosperous new year, to the great state of South Carolina." and to the bonds of family and fellowship that make this life worth living. He gestured to Isaac. Isaac, my finest Madeira for my guests. Time seemed to slow. The air grew thick, heavy as water. Isaac picked up the fine decanter. Its weight was familiar in his hand, cool and solid. He could feel the small pouch against his chest, a faint, malevolent warmth. As he walked toward the head of the table, he allowed his memory to flood him. Alara, humming a low lullaby as she mended Samuel's shirt by candlelight. The specific curve of her smile. Samuel's laughter, a sound like wind chimes. He saw the auction block, the trader's fleshy hands. He felt the whip. The fire in the hearth flared, and for a second the judge's face was illuminated, arrogant and serene. With his back momentarily to the rest of the room, Isaac's fingers moved with a speed born of 1,000 nights of practice. He loosened the stopper of the decanter, and with the thumb and forefinger of the same hand, he pinched the small pouch through his waistcoat. A tiny, almost imperceptible puff of fine, pale powder fell into the dark wine. It dissolved instantly, leaving no trace. He had tested it on rats, on a stray dog. It was silent, swift, and without obvious taste in a sweet, heavy wine like Madeira. He righted the stopper. The entire act took less than 3 seconds. He poured for the guests first, his hand steady, the wine gurgling softly into their glasses. Then he stood before the judge. He met the man's eyes for a fleeting moment. There was nothing there. No recognition of the life he had destroyed, the soul he had hollowed out. Isaac was furniture, and furniture does not hate. He tilted the decanter. The poisoned Madeira, the color of a dark and secret blood, splashed into the judge's glass. "To family!" the judge roared, and raised his glass high. The others echoed him. "To family!" Isaac stepped back, melting into the shadows near the fireplace. He watched as the judge drained his glass in one great swallow. The man smacked his lips, a satisfied, vulgar sound. He smiled, a wide, predatory smile, and then the smile faltered. A look of confusion crossed his face. He blinked, slowly, as if trying to clear a fog from his eyes. He put a hand to his throat. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The other guests, deep in their own conversations, did not notice at first. But Mrs. Abernathy did. "Thaddeus?" she said, her voice a thin thread of concern. "Are you quite well?" The judge's eyes widened. A fine sheen of sweat broke out on his brow. He tried to stand, but his legs seemed to buckle. He clawed at the tablecloth, his knuckles white, a glass tipped, spilling wine like a fresh wound across the white linen. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to the head of the table. The judge made a gagging sound, a low, wet, animal noise. His face, once ruddy, was turning a glass table, ghastly shade of purple. He looked around the room, his eyes wide with a terror that was just dawning, a primal fear that stripped away the layers of judge, planter, and master, leaving only a dying animal. His gaze fell on Isaac, standing still and silent by the fire, and in that last, lucid moment, in the widening pools of his pupils, Isaac saw a flicker of understanding, a horrifying, silent question. Then the judge pitched forward, his great body crashing onto the table with a sound like a felled tree. China shattered, silverware scattered. His head landed in a bowl of syllabub, the white cream a grotesque death shroud. The room erupted. A woman screamed, a high, piercing shriek that seemed to go on forever. Men shouted, chairs were knocked over. Mrs. Abernathy fainted dead away. In the maelstrom of chaos, no one was watching the man by the fire. No one saw him slip through the service door, move silently down the dark, cold hallway, and push open the back door into the waiting arms of the night. The damp, salty air was a shock to his lungs. The wind whipped at his face, cold and clean. He did not run. Not yet. He walked, calmly, across the frozen yard, past the silent slave cabins where his people huddled, listening to the screams from the great house. He walked past the cooperage, the source of his pride and his pain, the scent of turpentine, still hanging in the air like a ghost. He reached the edge of the property, where the manicured gardens gave way to the wild, tangled darkness of the low country swamp. He did not look back. Behind him was a life of bondage, a singular act of terrible retribution. Ahead was the unknown, freedom or death. He did not know which, and in that moment he did not care. He had poured the wine, he had served the supper, he had delivered his own terrible Christmas benediction, and now he was gone, a phantom swallowed by the cypress and the dark, whispering water. The hunt would begin at dawn. The sun rose on a world broken. At the Abernathy plantation, the light was pale and watery, illuminating a scene of disarray and muted panic. Judge Thaddeus Abernathy lay on his own dining table, now a makeshift bier, his body stiffening under a sheet. His wife was sedated with laudanum, her wails having finally subsided into shuddering sobs. His son, Elias, 22, and possessing all of his father's arrogance but none of his cunning, paced the library, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. "Poison," he spat, slamming a fist on his father's mahogany desk. "In my own house, at my own table, an act of war." Standing before him was Calin, the overseer, a man as lean and tough as cured leather, with pale, watchful eyes that missed nothing. He had been roused from his bed by the first screams from the great house. It was he who had confirmed the judge was dead, he who had locked down the plantation, ordering the patrollers to double their guard on the perimeter. "It was the Madeira, sir," Calin said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Only the judge drank from the decanter after the toast. The others drank from bottles opened at the table." "And who poured the wine?" Elias's voice was a low growl. Calin didn't hesitate. "Isaac." The name hung in the air like smoke. Isaac. The quiet one. The carpenter. The trusted house servant who had been with the family for 20 years. It seemed impossible. Isaac was a fixture, as much a part of the house as the grandfather clock in the hall. "Find him," Elias ordered, his voice cracking. "Search every cabin. Tear them apart if you have to. I want him in irons by noon." "He's not here," Calin said simply. "I've already had the cabins searched." Quietly, "His pallet is empty. His tools are gone from the cooperage. Not all of them. Just a few. A hand axe, a saw, a froe. The ones a man would need to survive in the swamp." Elias stared at him, the implications sinking in. This was not a crime of passion. It was planned, calculated. "The swamp," he whispered, looking out the window at the dark line of cypress trees that marked the edge of his property. The swamp was another country, a place of mud and shadow, of snakes and alligators and fevers that could kill a man in a day. "He has a good 12-hour start," Calin added. "And a storm is coming in from the sea. It will wash away any tracks." The search began in earnest. Calin was methodical, brutal. He rousted the enslaved from their cabins, lining them up in the cold morning light. He questioned them one by one, his eyes searching for any flicker of complicity, any hint of a lie. He questioned old Esther, the cook, who wept and swore Isaac had been a good man, quiet but good. He questioned young Thomas, the stable boy, who said he saw Isaac walking toward the swamp path just after the commotion started, walking calm as you please, like he was going for a stroll. The questioning yielded nothing of substance. Isaac had told no one. His secret was his own, a poison he had held inside himself for 2 long years, ever since the day they took Ilara and Samuel. The other slaves knew of his grief, of course. They had seen the light go out of his eyes. They had heard him at night, sometimes, a low, keening sound coming from his cabin, the sound of a man trying to carve a memory out of his own chest. But they knew nothing of his plan, and if they suspected, they said nothing. Their silence was a wall, smooth and impenetrable. Kalen got nothing but downcast eyes and trembling hands. By midday, the news had spread to Charleston. The murder of a prominent judge by his own slave was a spark thrown into a powder keg. It was every planter's deepest fear made real, the simmering rebellion beneath the veneer of genteel society suddenly erupting in their very dining rooms. Men rode out from town, forming impromptu posses, their faces grim, their rifles loaded. They were not just hunting a man, they were hunting an idea, the terrifying notion that the people they owned had minds and wills and hatreds of their own. In his small cabin, tucked away at the edge of the woods, Isaac had left almost nothing behind: a rough-hewn bed, a wooden stool he'd made himself, a worn Bible on a small shelf. But Kalen, in his meticulous search, found something tucked between the pages of the Book of Job. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, no bigger than his thumb. He recognized the style. Isaac had carved dozens of them for his son Samuel. Small, simple things that the boy had treasured. Finding it here, left behind, felt like a message, a statement of purpose. Kalen slipped it into his pocket, the smooth wood cool against his palm. As Kalen worked, Isaac was miles away, deep in the embrace of the swamp. The air was thick and humid, smelling of decay and wet earth. Cypress knees rose from the black water, like gnarled bones. The world was a labyrinth of green and brown, the canopy so thick that the light below was a perpetual twilight. He moved not with speed, but with a woodsman's deliberate care. He knew this land. In the years of his grief, he had taken to walking the edges of the swamp, finding a strange solace in its dangerous beauty. He knew the high ground, the game trails, the places where fresh water pooled. His body ached, not from exertion, but from the sudden release of a tension he had carried for 2 years. The act of the night before did not feel real. It was a scene he had replayed in his mind 1,000 times, and the memory of it was already blurring with the fantasy. What was real was the suck of mud on his worn boots, the sting of a mosquito on his neck, the weight of the tools in the sack on his back. He paused, leaning against the massive trunk of a cypress, and pulled a piece of hardtack from his pocket. As he chewed the dry biscuit, his mind drifted back. He saw Ilara's hands, her long, elegant fingers as she worked her loom, weaving threads of indigo and cotton into patterns only she could see. She used to hum a tune, a simple, nameless lullaby she'd learned from her own mother. It was a song of the river, of water flowing to the sea. He tried to recall the melody, but it was like trying to catch smoke. The notes were there, just beyond his grasp, a ghost in his memory. The loss of that tune felt sharper, somehow, than the memory of the judge's dying face. He closed his eyes, and the smell of the swamp was replaced by the clean, sharp scent of cedar and turpentine. His workshop. His sanctuary. He had been a master cooper, a craftsman. His barrels were sought after by planters up and down the coast. They were tight, perfectly balanced, works of art. He had taken pride in it. He had found dignity in the shaping of wood, in the creation of something useful and beautiful. Judge Abernathy had praised his work often, had shown him off to visitors. "My Isaac," he would say, "can make a barrel sing," and Isaac had allowed himself to believe that his skill afforded him a measure of protection, a place of value. He had been wrong. His skill, his loyalty, his humanity, none of it had mattered when the judge's gambling debts came due. He was property, no different from the barrels he made, and property could be sold. The sound of a distant dog barking snapped him back to the present. He stiffened, every muscle tensed. A hound. They were already hunting him. The 12-hour lead was not enough. He pushed himself off the tree and began to move again, faster this time, plunging deeper into the swamp's embrace. The black water seeped into his boots, cold and shocking. He had to find a place to hide, a place where the dogs would lose his scent. Back at the plantation, Elias Abernathy was growing desperate. The local posses, full of bluster and whiskey, had crashed through the swamp's edge for a few hours before retreating, their fine clothes torn, and their enthusiasm dampened by the mud and insects. They were not woodsmen. "We need a tracker," Kalen advised, standing on the veranda as the last of the posse rode away. "A man who knows the swamp, a man who specializes in this kind of work." Elias knew who he meant. There was only one man with that reputation in the Low Country, a man spoken of in whispers by the enslaved. A bogeyman used to frighten children. His name was Silas Rook. They said Rook was part Indian, that he could read a broken twig like a page in a book, that he could smell a runaway on the wind. He lived alone in a cabin on the Ashepoo River, and he worked for no man, but for a price, a high price. He was a hunter of men, and he was ruthlessly, terrifyingly good at it. "Send for him," Elias said, his voice tight. "Offer him whatever he asks. I want Isaac's head on a pike at my gate by New Year's Day." Kalen nodded, a grim satisfaction in his eyes. He understood this. This was not about justice. It was about restoring order. It was about making an example so terrifying that no slave would ever again dream of raising a hand against his master. The hunt was no longer a local matter. With Silas Rook involved, it had become a blood sport. The message was sent, and in a cabin miles away, a lean, silent man with eyes the color of a winter sky began to sharpen his knives and check the leads on his two gaunt, scarred Catahoula hounds. The game was afoot. The storm that Kalen had predicted rolled in off the Atlantic, a gray wall of water and wind. It lashed the coast for 2 days, turning the swamp into a churning, flooded world. For Isaac, it was a blessing and a curse. The rain washed away his trail, confounding the dogs and trackers who would surely follow. But it also made survival a grim, minute-by-minute struggle. He found shelter in a hollowed-out cypress log, a space barely large enough to crawl into. He lay there in the damp darkness, listening to the roar of the wind and the percussive drumming of the rain. The water rose steadily, turning the ground around him into a shallow lake. He was cold, soaked to the bone, and a deep, gnawing hunger had settled in his belly. The last of his hardtack was gone. In the dark, with the storm as his only companion, his mind became a battleground. The image of the judge's death replayed itself, but it brought him no satisfaction, no peace. The brief, fiery triumph of that moment had already cooled into a gray ash of reality. He had not killed slavery. He had not freed his people. He had only killed a man, and in doing so he had untethered himself from the world, setting himself adrift in this wilderness. His thoughts turned, as they always did, to Elara and Samuel. He wondered where they were. Louisiana was a vast, terrifying word, a place from which no one returned. Were they together? Had they been sold separately? The not knowing was a separate kind of torture, a wound that would not scab over. He clutched the small leather pouch he still wore around his neck. It was empty now, save for the faint floral scent of jessamine, a memory of his revenge. He should throw it away, but he couldn't. It was the last thing Elara had made for him. He remembered her singing the lullaby, the one about the river. He strained to hear it, to piece the notes together in the roaring of the storm. Water run, sun go down. The words were fragments, echoes. Mama hold you, safe and sound. He hummed what he could remember, a tuneless, desperate sound in the dark. The song was a fragile thread connecting him to a life that was gone forever. It was all he had left of them. When the storm finally broke on the 3rd day, the world was washed clean. The sun burned through the clouds, steam rising from the wet earth. Isaac crawled from his hiding place, stiff and shivering. The water had receded, leaving behind a slick coat of black mud. He knew he had to find food, and soon. He used his froe, a tool for splitting shingles, to dig for grubs and roots. He set snares for rabbits, his hands remembering the skills he'd learned as a boy. On the fourth day, he caught a marsh rabbit. He built a small, smokeless fire of dry twigs in a dense thicket and cooked it, the smell of the roasting meat making his stomach cramp with desire. The simple act of providing for himself, of using his hands and his knowledge to wrest a meal from the wilderness, sparked a tiny ember of something he hadn't felt in years, a flicker of purpose that was not about revenge, but about survival. Meanwhile, Silas Rook had arrived at the Abernathy plantation. He did not ride up to the great house. He came on foot from the river, his 2 hounds, Cain and Abel, trotting silently at his heels. He was not what Elias Abernathy expected. He was not a large, brutish man. He was of medium height, wiry and weathered, with a face that seemed carved from driftwood. He moved with a quiet, unnerving grace. His pale eyes took in everything, assessing, calculating. He did not speak to Elias. He spoke only to Caleb, man to man, professional to professional. He walked the grounds, sniffing the air like one of his dogs. He examined Isaac's cabin, his eyes lingering on the empty space where the tools should have been. He ran a hand over the smooth wood of the carving Caleb had found. "He's a craftsman," Rook said, his voice a low rasp. "A patient man, not a field hand who broke and ran. This was planned. He'll be smart." He took one of Isaac's old work shirts from the cabin and let his dog scent it. The hounds, usually restless and whining, became utterly still, their noses twitching, committing the smell to memory. "The storm gave him a gift," Rook said, looking toward the swamp. "But the water leaves a mark, too. It pushes everything to high ground. That's where we'll start." He asked for nothing but a side of bacon and a bag of cornmeal. He and his dogs would live off the land, just as their quarry was. He was not a leader of posses. He was a lone hunter, and he preferred it that way. The hunt began. Rook was relentless, a phantom in Isaac's wake. He moved through the swamp with an unnerving ease, his hounds working in a deadly, silent ballet ahead of him. They found the hollow log where Isaac had sheltered during the storm. They found the remains of his small fire, the rabbit bones picked clean. Rook was piecing together the story of Isaac's survival, reading the landscape for clues. Each sign he found was a victory, bringing him closer, tightening the invisible net. Isaac knew he was being followed. He didn't need to see Rook or hear the dogs. He could feel it, a prickling on the back of his neck, a change in the way the birds fell silent as he passed. The swamp, which had been his sanctuary, was becoming a cage, and the walls were closing in. He started moving at night, resting during the day in the high branches of cypress trees, or buried in mud and reeds along the water's edge. He became nocturnal, a creature of shadow. His skills as a carpenter were what kept him alive. He used his tools to build deadfall traps for food. He fashioned a crude fishing spear from a sapling. He could look at a stand of trees and know which wood was best for a fire, which for a shelter, which branch would hold his weight. His hands, which had once crafted fine barrels, now crafted survival. The smell of turpentine and cedar in his memory was replaced by the raw, living scent of cut pine and cypress. One afternoon, hiding in a dense canebrake, he saw them, Rook and his hounds, moving along the opposite bank of a sluggish creek. Rook was a silhouette against the afternoon sun, lean and purposeful. The dogs moved with their noses to the ground, their tails low. Isaac's heart hammered against his ribs. The proximity of the hunter was a physical blow. He watched as one of the dogs, Cain, paused, its head lifting, its nose testing the air. It had scented him. Isaac didn't hesitate. He slipped backward, silent as a water snake, into the creek. The water was cold, the mud on the bottom soft and yielding. He submerged himself completely, leaving only his nose and eyes above the surface, hidden amongst a patch of lily pads. He held his breath until his lungs burned. He could hear the dog whining, agitated. He heard Rook's low voice calming the animal. "Easy, boy. The water hides it. He's close." Isaac stayed submerged, the water a cold shroud, his body trembling. He could feel the three-pronged scar on his backache, a familiar phantom of pain. In his mind's eye, he saw not Rook, but the overseer, Kalen, with his whip. He saw the judge's face, bloated and purple. He saw Elara and Samuel being driven away. The rage, which had cooled to embers, flared hot again. It was a fuel, burning away the cold and the fear. He would not be taken. He would not be put in chains and dragged back to be made an example. He would rather die here, in this black water, than give them the satisfaction. He waited. An hour passed. 2. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and blood. When he was sure they were gone, he slowly, carefully, pulled himself from the water, shivering, covered in mud. He was a creature of the swamp now, remade in its image. He looked in the direction Rook had gone. The hunt was not over. It had just become personal. He was no longer just the hunted. He was a survivor. And he would not be easy prey. Days bled into weeks. The pursuit became a grim, protracted chess match, played across a board of cypress swamp and salt marsh. Isaac learned Rook's rhythms, the way he would make a cold camp at dusk, the way he favored the high ground. Rook, in turn, learned Isaac's mind, his cleverness, his deep-seated instinct for survival. He found Isaac's abandoned snares, the subtle trail markers he left for himself, the way he used waterways to mask his scent. There was a strange, emerging respect in the hunt, the kind a wolf might have for a particularly cunning stag. Isaac grew leaner, harder. His skin was cross-hatched with scratches and insect bites. The civilized man who had polished silver in the Abernathy dining room was gone, stripped away by hunger and fear and the constant grinding effort of staying alive. In his place was someone more elemental, his senses sharpened. He could smell rain on the wind hours before it fell. He could distinguish the sound of a moccasin slipping through the water from the rustle of a squirrel in the leaves. The swamp was teaching him its language, and he was a desperate, avid student. His inner world was a quiet, desolate place. The roaring fire of his rage had banked down to a steady, hot coal of resolve. His grief for Elara and Samuel was no longer a sharp, open wound, but a constant, dull ache, a part of him like a bone or a vital organ. He talked to them sometimes, in a low whisper, when the loneliness became a physical presence. He would tell Elara about the heron he saw that morning, its stark white form against the black water. He would tell Samuel about the clever raccoon that kept trying to steal from his traps. It was a way of keeping them alive, of populating his desolate solitude. And he tried to remember the lullaby. It came to him in frustrating snatches, a line here, a melody there, always dissolving, just as he thought he had it. River deep, and the moon is high. The missing pieces were a torment. He felt if he could just remember the whole song, he could somehow conjure Elara's presence, her strength. The song became a talisman, a lost piece of his own soul he was trying to reclaim. One evening, huddled in a shelter he'd fashioned from palmetto fronds, a new sound drifted through the swamp. It was singing, a low, powerful chorus of voices, rising and falling in the humid air. It was a spiritual, a song of sorrow and hope. He had heard songs like it in the praise houses on the plantation, but this was different. It was wilder, freer. Driven by a curiosity that overrode his caution, he moved toward the sound. He came to a small island of high ground, a hummock deep in the swamp, hidden by a maze of waterways. In a clearing, lit by a single smoky fire, was a small community, a dozen or so people, men, women, a few children, runaways like him. They had built crude shelters, planted a small garden of corn and yams. They were a maroon community, a hidden village of the lost and the defiant. He watched from the shadows for a long time. He saw a woman who reminded him of Ilara, her hands deftly weaving a basket from sweetgrass. He saw a man showing a young boy how to fletch an arrow. They were a ghost tribe, living in the heart of the wilderness, having carved out a precarious freedom for themselves. He was not alone. His presence was eventually discovered. A man with a long scar down his face and carrying a fire-hardened spear stepped from the shadows and confronted him. Isaac did not run. He stood his ground, holding his hands up to show he was unarmed. "Who are you?" the man asked, his voice a low growl. "My name is Isaac," he said. The man's eyes widened slightly. "Isaac of Charleston? The one who poisoned the judge?" The story had traveled, passed in whispers from plantation to plantation, carried by boatmen and field hands, until it had become a legend, a myth that had found its way, even to this remote corner of the swamp. Isaac had ceased to be a man. He was a story now. He was brought into the village. They shared their food with him, a stew of squirrel and wild onion, and he ate like a starving man. He learned their leader was the man with the spear, who called himself Moses. He had been living in the swamp for 10 years, ever since escaping a rice plantation on the Combahee River. He and the others were a patchwork of survivors, a testament to the indomitable will to be free. Isaac stayed with them. He did not fully join them. He was too much of a loner, too haunted by his own ghosts, but he found a fragile sense of community. He used his skills to help, repairing their shelters, building a clever system of deadfall traps that kept them supplied with game, carving tools and toys for the children. The feel of the wood in his hands, the scent of fresh-cut cypress, began to heal something in him. He was a maker again, not just a survivor. He learned from them, too. Moses taught him how to use medicinal plants, how to read the stars to find his way, how to move through the swamp without leaving a trace. He was shedding the last vestiges of the plantation and becoming a true man of the wilderness. But Silas Rook was still out there. One day, one of the Maroons who had been scouting the edges of the swamp returned, his face grim. "The hunter with the pale eyes is back," he reported. "He's working a grid pattern moving west from the Wando River. He's patient. He will find this place eventually." A pall fell over the small community. They had fought off posses before, but Rook was different. He was a force of nature, as relentless as the swamp itself. Moses came to Isaac that night as he sat by the fire, carving a small wooden bird, an echo of the one he had left behind. "You brought him here," Moses said, not with anger, but with a weary resignation. "His hunt for you has led him to our door." "I will leave at dawn," Isaac said, his voice quiet. "Lead him away from here." "He will follow you," Moses said, "and he will catch you. You are one man. He is a devil." He paused, looking into the fire. "There is a story of a place far to the north. They call it Canada. A place where a man can be a man, under the law. But the journey is long, and the hunters are many." He gave Isaac directions, a mental map passed down from other runaways. "Follow the North Star. Cross the great rivers at night. Find the people who will help. The Quakers, the free blacks in the cities." It was a desperate, almost impossible path. "Your revenge is done, Isaac," Moses said, his voice softening. "You avenged your family. Now you must live for them. To survive is its own victory, the greatest victory." The words struck a chord deep inside Isaac. For months, his focus had been on evasion, on not being caught. He had not dared to think beyond that. The idea of a future, of a place called Canada, was a seed of hope. So terrifying and so beautiful it made him ache. To live. To be free. Not just to escape, but to arrive somewhere. He knew what he had to do. He could not just run. He had to end the hunt. He had to confront the devil in the swamp, on his own terms. He spent the next day preparing. He sharpened his axe. He packed a small pouch with dried meat and corn. He studied the crude map Moses had drawn for him in the dirt. He was looking for a place where he could choose the ground, a place for a final confrontation. He found it on the map and in his memory. An old, abandoned praise house on a bend in the river, miles from the maroon village. It had been swallowed by the swamp, its foundation sinking into the mud, its roof caved in. But it was a place he knew, a place where the terrain was treacherous, full of quicksand and tangled thickets, a place where a smart man could lay a trap. That night, he said his goodbyes to the small band of survivors. Moses gripped his shoulder. "Go with God, Isaac of Charleston." Isaac slipped away into the darkness, a ghost, leaving a village of ghosts. He was no longer just running from Silas Rook. He was now hunting the hunter. He moved with a new purpose, a cold, clear certainty in his heart. The fear was gone, replaced by something harder, something forged in the crucible of the swamp. He was going to the river, and one way or another he was going to be free. Isaac moved with the deliberate precision of a carpenter planning his final, most intricate piece of joinery. He did not go directly to the abandoned praise house. Instead, he laid a trail, a calculated and enticing path for Silas Rook to follow. It was a trail that spoke of fatigue and carelessness. A broken branch here, a footprint too deep in the mud there, a dropped piece of dried meat near a stream. He was baiting the trap, drawing the wolf into his parlor. The old praise house stood on a bluff overlooking a deep, fast-moving channel of the river. The years had not been kind to it. The walls, made of cypress planks, were rotten and green with moss. The roof was a skeleton of rafters, open to the sky. But the floor, made of thick, heart-pine boards, was mostly intact. And beneath it, the ground was soft and marshy, honeycombed with the burrows of muskrats and snakes. Isaac spent a full day preparing the site. He used his saw to weaken the main support beam beneath the center of the floor, cutting it almost all the way through but leaving just enough solid wood to hold. He worked silently, the gentle rasp of the saw blade a quiet prayer. He covered his work with mud and dead leaves. Then, using his froe and axe, he dug a shallow pit directly under the weakened section, filling it with sharpened stakes of fire-hardened cane, their points angled upward. It was a crude but deadly deadfall, a trap designed not for a rabbit but for a man. He finished his work as dusk fell. He sat in the doorway of the ruined church, looking out at the river. The water was dark and swift, a powerful current pulling toward the sea. He thought of the lullaby. Water run, sun go down. He thought of Moses's words. To survive is its own victory. He was not just setting a trap for Rook. He was building a door for himself. On the calm other side of this night was either death or the long road north. He ate the last of his food and waited. He did not need to wait long. Just after midnight, under a sliver of moon, he heard the faint, telltale sound, the soft padding of the hounds. Rook was coming. Isaac moved to the back of the praise house, concealing himself in a dense thicket of jessamine vines. The sweet, cloying scent of the yellow flowers filled the air. It was a fitting place for an end. The flower that had begun his journey would now bear witness to its conclusion. Rook approached with inhuman caution. He did not come straight on. He circled the clearing, a ghost in the moonlight, his rifle held at the ready. His hounds, Cain and Abel, moved ahead of him, their noses to the ground, whining softly. They scented Isaac. They knew he was near, but the swirling river breeze and the dense vegetation confused them. Rook paused at the edge of the clearing, studying the dilapidated church. Isaac could see his face, a mask of concentration. He was a master of his craft, and he sensed that something was wrong. The trail had been too easy. The destination was too obvious. "Come on out, Isaac." Rook's voice was a low rasp, barely disturbing the night silence. "There's no more running. The boy master wants you alive if he can get you, but he'll settle for dead." Isaac remained silent, his heart a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. He controlled his breathing, making himself a part of the shadows, a part of the night. Rook took a tentative step into the clearing. The dogs fanned out, circling the church. One of them, Cain, stopped directly over the weakened section of the floor and began to bark, a sharp, excited sound. It had pinpointed Isaac's scent, where he had worked on the trap. "Good boy," Rook murmured, and began to walk toward the church door, his boots making soft, sucking sounds in the mud. He was being careful, his eyes scanning the darkness, his rifle sweeping back and forth. But his attention was focused on the front of the church, on the door, on the shadows where he expected Isaac to be hiding. He was not looking at the ground beneath his feet. He stepped up onto the porch, the old wood groaning under his weight. He entered the church, a dark silhouette against the moonlit river, visible through the back wall. He moved toward the center of the room, toward the spot where his dog was barking. And then it happened. There was a crack, a sound like a great bone snapping. The floor gave way with a sudden, sickening lurch. Rook cried out, a sharp exclamation of surprise and pain, as he plunged into the darkness below. The sound of his body hitting the cane stakes was a wet, percussive thud. One of the dogs, caught on the edge of the collapse, yelped and scrambled back. The other, the one who had been barking, fell with his master. Silence. A thick, profound silence, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the rush of the river. Isaac waited. A minute. 2 minutes. He emerged from the jessamine thicket, his hand axe clutched tight in his hand. He approached the hole in the floor cautiously. The surviving hound, Abel, snarled at him from the far side of the clearing, its hackles raised, but it did not attack. It was confused, its master gone. He peered into the pit. The moonlight cast a pale, ghostly light on the scene below. Rook was impaled on 3 of the stakes. One had taken him through the thigh, another through the shoulder. The third had gone through his gut. His dog lay beside him, its back broken, whimpering softly. Rook was alive. His pale eyes, wide with shock and agony, found Isaac's in the darkness. "Clever," Rook gasped, a trickle of blood running from the corner of his mouth. "Clever carpenter." Isaac said nothing. He looked down at the man who had hunted him for weeks, the man who was a legend, now broken and dying in a pit of his own making. He felt no triumph. He felt no pity. He felt only a vast, empty stillness. Rook's breath came in ragged gasps. "You won't make it," he wheezed. "They'll send others. They'll never stop." His voice trailed off. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound. His eyes, fixed on Isaac, began to glaze over. The legendary tracker, the devil of the swamp, died in a ruined church, defeated by a man he had considered his prey. Isaac stood there for a long time. He could have left Rook's body for the buzzards, but some vestige of the man he once was, the man who respected order and craft, would not allow it. Using a rope he had brought, he carefully lowered himself into the pit. He pulled the stakes free, an act of grim, intimate violence. Then he hauled Rook's body out of the hole. He did the same for the dead dog. He laid them side by side on the floor of the praise house. A final, strange act of respect for a fallen adversary. He did not take Rook's rifle. He had no use for it. His tools were his weapons, his mind his best defense. He took only the man's compass and his water skin. He went down to the river bank. The surviving hound watched him, a silent, lonely sentinel. Isaac looked across the water, then up at the sky. He found the North Star, the drinking gourd, the celestial signpost of his people. It shone with a cold, clear light. He waded into the river. The current was strong, pulling at him, trying to drag him down. But he was strong too. He swam, his powerful arms pulling him through the black water, away from the ruined church, away from the body of his pursuer, away from the land of his enslavement. When he reached the far bank, he did not look back. He pulled himself onto the shore, slick with mud, and stood for a moment, water streaming from his body. He was shivering, but he was alive. He was free. He turned his face to the north and began to walk. Behind him, the story of Isaac of Charleston dissolved into myth. Some said he was devoured by the swamp, that Silas Rook had killed him and his body was never found. Some said he had drowned trying to cross the river. But among the enslaved, a different story was whispered. They said he had wings, that he had flown north. They said he had turned into a shadow and simply walked away. They said that on quiet nights, you could hear him in the swamp, humming a strange, sad lullaby about a river flowing to the sea. The body of Silas Rook was found a week later by a party of hunters, laid out in the ruined Praise House. There was no sign of Isaac. No tracks. No trace. He had vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind only a name, a legend, and a single haunting question. What became of the man who had poisoned his master's wine? The swamp kept its secrets. The river flowed on. And the North Star waited, a silent, distant promise. Epilogue, Sar October 1895, *. The young man adjusted his spectacles and knocked on the door of the small, tidy cabin on the outskirts of Beaufort. He was a journalist for a Negro newspaper in Philadelphia, a new man for a new century, and he had come south to collect the old stories, the histories that had never been written down. An old woman with skin like wrinkled parchment and eyes that held the memory of a different world opened the door. Her name was Hattie, and she had been born on the Abernathy plantation. He sat with her on her porch for hours, a pot of chicory coffee between them, and listened. She told him of the cruelties of Calin, the overseer, and the arrogance of the judge. And then, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, she told him the story of Isaac. They called him Isaac of the Jessamine after he was gone, she said, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. Because that was his tool, see? The little yellow flower that smiles so pretty and kills so quiet. The masters, they said the swamp ate him. But we knew better. Isaac was too smart for the swamp. He was the swamp. She leaned closer, her eyes bright. After he was gone, things changed. Not all at once, but there was a new feeling in the air. A little less fear. A little more possibility. The young ones would carve little birds, like the ones Isaac made for his boy. Leave on the overseer's doorstep. Find in the master's tobacco pouch. A silent message. A warning. And sometimes, when a child cried in the night, the mamas wouldn't shush 'em. They'd hum a little tune, a song about a river. She hummed a few bars. The melody was simple, haunting, and achingly sad. It was a fragment, a piece of a forgotten song. The journalist wrote it all down in his notebook, his pen scratching furiously. A decade later, in 1905, the old Abernathy plantation house, having passed through several owners and fallen into disrepair, was being renovated. A worker, tearing out a wall in what had once been the judge's library, found a small, hidden compartment. Inside was a bundle of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. They were written by Clara Abernathy, the judge's daughter, who had been a young woman on that terrible Christmas Eve, and had later married and moved to Virginia. They were written to her sister. One letter, dated January 1838, described the aftermath of the poisoning. It was filled with the expected horror and grief, but near the end, a different tone emerged, a confession whispered across the decades. And yet, sister, I must confess a terrible thought. I saw Isaac's face as he served the wine. I had seen that face before. It was the same hollow, empty mask he wore the day Papa sold his wife and child away. I saw it then, and I saw it that night, and I believe I am the only one who truly understood. Papa reaped what he sowed. Does that make me a monster? To think such a thing of my own father? I do not know what became of Isaac, but I pray to God he found what he was looking for. I pray he found a peace that this house could never offer. The letter caused a minor sensation among local historians, a footnote in the brutal history of the Low Country. It added a layer of complexity to the legend, a hint of complicity from within the great house itself. But the legend of Isaac lived on, mostly in the stories of the Gullah people of the Sea Islands. They said he had made it to Canada, had found work as a shipwright, and had lived to be a very old man. They said he had sent money south, through secret channels, to buy the freedom of others. Others said he never left the South, that he had become the leader of that maroon village, a dark-skinned Moses, leading his people in the wilderness. There is no record of an Isaac from Charleston in the abolitionist archives of Philadelphia or Boston. No ship's manifest bears his name. History, in its official capacity, is silent. His fate remains a mystery, an unanswered question. But what is freedom if not a mystery? It is not a destination, but a journey. It is not an arrival, but a constant, fluid state of becoming. For Isaac, freedom began with an act of terrible, clarifying violence. It was nurtured in the lonely darkness of a swamp. It was paid for with the blood of his hunter. And it was finally realized in the simple, profound act of turning his face to the north and taking one step and then another into an unknown future. Was it justice? Was it revenge? Perhaps it was something else entirely. Perhaps it was simply a balancing of the scales, a life for a life, a story for a story. The master's story ended at a banquet table, surrounded by wealth and family, a death of shock and horror. The slave's story has no end. It flows on, like a river in a half-remembered lullaby, a ghost of a tune hummed in the dark, a haunting melody of survival against impossible odds, a testament to the enduring, unbreakable, and terrifying power of a man who has nothing left to lose.